is one of the most popular platform fighting games to ever exist. Even if you've never heard of the game before, you likely know of this infamous clip.
Happy feet, wombo combo. That ain't Falco. That ain't Falco. Oh, 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 oh. Where you at? Where you at?
This game is so well known, it has not only become a giant in its field, but it's basically a legend at this point. It not only keeps its old players, but it constantly gains new ones. What is it that causes everybody to look at this game so fondly? For that, we kind of need to look at it from the beginning. On November 21st, 2001, Super Smash Bros. Melee was released for the GameCube. It was a widely awaited sequel to the first in the franchise, Super Smash Bros. Nintendo 64. Many people were excited at the game's popularity at this point, but no one actually viewed it as anything more than a casual party game, even the developers, Masahiro Sakurai. And if that was the end of this game's story, then I would have no story to talk about. There'd be no topic here. However, this wasn't. It was an incredibly buggy game on launch, and in a time where you couldn't just release hot patches, this was the final product. Some of these notable bugs include wobbling, the chain dance, and most notably, Melee's unique movement, the wave dash. It's so well known, in fact, that many developers have put it into their game intentionally. These advanced techniques caused people with more of a competitive drive to start playing the game, which caused a rise in the competitive Melee scene, which incidentally led to the first publicized tournament being held in 2002, in which many players came to show off their mastery of the mechanics. This single tournament held by a man known as Matt Deasy, who is now known as the founder of Smash competitive play, kickstarted Melee into what people refer as the golden age of the game's history. This was a time where Super Smash Bros. Was being played in the biggest platforms of play, even making an occurrence at MLG New York 2004. However, much like all games, they will eventually lose notability and recognition due to the next in line of the series. For Melee, this was Super Smash Bros. Brawl, which started to dominate the competitive scene after its release on March 2008. Many Melee players feared that their game was reaching the end of its life cycle, which, from the look of things, was kind of turning into a reality. Without really a single Melee major being held throughout the entirety of 2008, the Melee player count seemed to remain stagnant as many players refused to leave the game because they couldn't stand Brawl's less complex mechanics, which was an intentional move by the developer to keep the game more casual, including things like tripping, where your character would just randomly fall over and ruin a combo, and the removal of advanced tech like wave dashing made Melee's player count really sour at the game, and had fear of where the game series was heading, as the developers continued to neglect any competitive interest in the game. It was clear that at this point, they never really wanted Smash to be competitive, but Melee would finally find its chance to shine once again when Alucard held a tournament called Revival of Melee, which featured some of the most notable Melee players of all time, Mewtwo King, Mango, and Azen, and was the first to do so since 2008. This last stand and the stubbornness of the Melee community as a whole seemed to possibly be enough, as despite not being featured in any major tournaments, the game is slowly returning to the popularity it had pre-Brawl. There was a list of new players who came to the scene, and they were given the title of the Five Gods. These players were so good that it was unheard of for them to lose to anyone other than a fellow god. This tempted even more people to join the scene, as an attempt to dethrone one of them. This led to the game's Platinum Age, a point where the game's popularity grew to unprecedented numbers. The community had grown from a tight-knit niche community to a game which involved the rest of the esports community as a whole. The game even ended up being featured at one of the biggest fighting game tournaments of its time, EVO 2013, where Melee won the fundraiser to be entered into the 8th and final spot, thanks to a Melee podcast called Melee It On Me, and many other organized efforts. Together, they raised a grand total of $95,000, which was the most that has ever been put on the line for this game. It became one of the most entered tournaments, almost doubling the number of entries as Pound 4, which was previous record holder. This caused interest in the game to peak even further into uncharted territory, as the game and majors were increasing at a staggering rate, eventually leading to Melee's so-called Summer of Smash, in which the game would not be featured at not just one, but 3 of the world's biggest fighting tournaments. It took stage at MLG Anaheim 2014, CEO 2014, and EVO 2014. This made the game's growth seem almost unreal to many people, as it attracted nearly 1,000 entries, which was an unseen number before at this point. At this point in the game's history, it was over a decade old, but it hit the peak of its popularity. Many players in the competitive fighting game community had still refused to take in Melee as one of them. But many fighting game teams, notably Cloud9, Team Curse, and Evil Geniuses, began to sponsor Melee's top players. While the players and the teams were trying to garner recognition for this game as a competitive giant, the developers of Nintendo were very openly hostile to the idea of this game ever being played in tournament, even going as far as to block streaming the Melee portion of EVO 2013. Though, strangely enough, seemed to make an effort to reconcile this, as Reggie of Nintendo America made a guest appearance through a video call at EVO 2014 just a year later, congratulating the tournament's top 8 finalists, perhaps in preparation for their next game in the franchise, Super Smash Bros. 4, which had no impact on the popularity of Melee. Many people didn't like the slow, less combo-based play of the game, though it should be noted it was not nearly as despised as people had for Brawl. It seemed at this point that Melee had itself cemented in competitive play and was not going anywhere. And other than a few new challengers to the Five Gods, not much had changed until 2016. The release of Super Smash Bros. Ultimate. By this time, many of the Five Gods had stepped away from competitive Melee, some citing health issues such as arthritis linked to the game's requirement on precise and fast hand movements. Many of the other members of the Five Gods had begun to pick up Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, the newest in the franchise. Soon, they began playing and streaming it over Melee content. For the first time since Brawl, it felt like the Melee community was losing to a new title. This was known as the Chaotic Age, where most of the full-time players of the game had dedicated themselves to Ultimate over Melee. Melee was, of course, still far from dead. It was featured alongside Ultimate in the Smash World Tour of 2020. It was going well for both games, and it even looked like they might be able to coexist, until the global pandemic took the world by storm. Many tournaments were called off, and most players refused to travel to the ones that stayed opened. Ultimate and Melee alike a massive hit due to this. Without any way to natively perform online play for Melee, many players took to a modded version of the game on the Dolphin emulator for netplay. The use of delay-based netcode, however, meant international play was nearly impossible due to the drastic delay. Many players didn't like the idea of online tournaments to begin with, and this was just making it worse for them, which ended up causing Ultimate tournaments to be way more popular than Melee at this point. This was due to the fact that Ultimate had native online play, and if both sides had stable internet, it was playable. This caused interest in online tournaments to wane, until Fizzy had made a surprise announcement that the team behind Project Slippy had managed to incorporate rollback netcode into Super Smash Bros. Melee, allowing Melee netplay to work over large distances with little latency. With the arrival of a viable way to play the game, many players were excited to jump on the opportunity, including those who were growing tired of the problems of Ultimate's online service, as not everybody had stable internet connection, which was required to play the game without massive performance hiccups. This increased attention to Slippy, however, came with concerns that Nintendo would soon go after it and cancel events running it. And those concerns were perfectly justified from what has been shown in the past with Nintendo blocking EVO 2014 from streaming. On November 19th, 2020, the team behind the Big House series, which saw massive tournaments sponsored by Nintendo, announced that Nintendo sent them a cease and desist letter over their use of Slippy and the Big House tournament. This caused many people to be outraged at Nintendo, and even started a hashtag which was trending in minutes called #FreeMelee. This was not the only hurdle the Melee community would face, however, as in July 2020, numerous allegations of sexual misconduct would surface against over 150 members of the Smash community, which included many of Melee's most notable players and commentators, which ended up with these members being isolated and shunned by the community. A good move overall. Many still didn't feel it was enough, though, and argued that the mostly grassrooted community didn't do enough to protect women and minors against sexual assault, and that it shouldn't have to be a concern for people who want to show up. After some reflection from the community and the quarantine list on tournaments, on July 15, 2021, the first major offline post-quarantine tournament was held at Smash Summit 11. This officially marked the day for the return of offline Melee play. The pandemic also gave rise to a new generation of players nicknamed Slippy Kids who started attending tourneys with varying results. Despite Melee's hiccups in the roads and the game's developers trying to stop its competitive play at some of the most defining moments in it, I think the one thing that keeps this game going is simply its community. This game may have one of, if not the most dedicated fan bases out there. They simply wish to enjoy a game that they think should be enjoyed. In their eyes, no other game can match the complexity and overall wacky shenanigans that you can get into with this game. If you talk to any Melee player, they will tell you the game is awful. Not in a way that it's bad, but it's a mess, and it's a beautiful mess because of that. There will never be a game like this because its success was a mistake. It was never intended to be played the way it's played. It is because the people loved bugs and they loved making weird combos with them. And some of the stuff you can pull off, like shooting master hand bullets out of Link's bow, genuinely look like a mod. And that's why it's great. It's a wild west of a game with no one other than the community to govern it. To the Melee community, it will always be this, no matter how much anyone may try to tame it. Now, given all the information, why do you think it survived?